You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 121. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hello, my friend. Welcome back to the podcast. It's Paula here, and I'm delighted to have you here with me this week. Thank you for tuning in. Today's topic is one that resonates with a number of lawyers that I speak with, lawyers who feel stuck, lawyers who are in jobs that they no longer want to be in, and yet they decide to stay. Now, this may be a topic that you can relate to, particularly if you have tuned into this podcast episode because you want some guidance for this particular situation. Now, this is not a podcast episode where I'm going to try to talk you out of staying where you are and taking a new job and taking a risk and all that. No, this episode is all about what to do when you're in the position where you know in your heart of hearts that this is not feeling right for you. You do not think that there is a future where you are, and yet, for whatever reason, you decide to stay. I'm going to offer you 4 suggestions on how you can manage this stage of your career in a way that is proactive and leaves you better off versus staying where you are, feeling stuck and not making any positive moves while you stay where you are, even though you know it's not the best fit for you. So I mentioned that this is a topic that comes up frequently with lawyers that I speak with. And it comes up for a number of reasons. Sometimes you may find yourself in a job and everything is amazing. It's the perfect job for you. You are challenged. You love your work. You love your colleagues. Everything feels great. You can see yourself having a promising future exactly where you are. And then something changes. Sometimes it's a sudden change. It may be that you work on a team with a particular lawyer. Maybe it's a mentor, somebody that you've worked with closely over the years. Maybe it's a colleague, again, where you've got that really tight relationship, and then that person leaves the firm or organization for whatever reason. Maybe they join another organization, maybe they retire, and you find yourself in the same organization, but with a very different working environment. You may find that the work that you're doing is different, that there's less of a supply of the work that you were really engaged and passionate about. You may find that there's fewer mentorship opportunities for you, that you're not learning and developing at the same pace that you were at before. It may be that instead of working with that particular person or that particular group of people, you're now working with other lawyers who maybe you don't connect with quite on the same level. The style of their work, the nature of their work just doesn't align as much as you had experienced previously. And so you find that you're really struggling and you no longer see yourself having that same future that you may have seen yourself as having before. Now, it could also be that something shifts within your own life. This happens often when lawyers, for example, start families and they find that there's a significant shift in their personal life that has a direct impact on their professional life, whether it's their capacity to be available for work, whether it's that they have a shift in terms of their values and what they want to be doing professionally. So there are a number of reasons why a job that you loved previously may all of a sudden not be a great fit for you. And yet, in that situation, you may choose not to leave for a number of different reasons. Now, it's also possible that the shift that you experience in terms of your level of satisfaction isn't one that was caused by a particular event. It may be that it's simply something that developed over time. Sometimes you may find that in an organization is amazing. You first start out there, you feel challenged, you love it, you love the people, everything seems to resonate really strongly. And then over time, almost like a series of small little things that start to add up, you realize that you are drifting away from being engaged in your work. You may find that maybe the work is no longer challenging for you. You may find that what excited you before about your work is no longer interesting. Again, you may find that there's a gradual shift in terms of the individuals who make up the organization. And so, like the previous example where somebody leaves or there's a significant change in your life, you may find over time that you no longer feel that sense of connection to your work. And again, you're finding yourself in this position where you don't see yourself there in the long term. You're having trouble connecting. You think you want to leave, and yet there are reasons that you decide that you're going to stay. Now, some of the reasons that I have heard from lawyers that I have worked with are as follows. I have 3 reasons. These are not the only reasons, but they're ones that come up relatively frequently. The first is that your family depends on you for your income, and you don't know how else you would replace that income. So this happens, for example, where you have built up your practice to a certain level. You've got a number of clients who are your clients. You enjoy a certain level of compensation. And when you think about going to another firm, for example, or you think about going to a different type of organization, you don't see how you would be able to replace your income, at least not right away. And you might look at other options and say, well, those options may have a certain appeal from a substantive standpoint, from an interest standpoint, but you don't think that you can afford to make the switch currently. Now, this isn't to say that there are options that you could go to where your income would remain the same, if not be greater. But as I mentioned at the outset, today's topic is really about choosing to stay where you are. And so what I'm offering are some of the reasons that have been offered to me in terms of why lawyers stay where they are, even though they think they want to leave. So one is financial. A second reason is sometimes, given the parameters or the circumstances of your personal life, you do not feel like it is a good time for you to make any significant changes in your professional life. This comes up, for example, when somebody close to you has health challenges. Somebody is sick. Maybe it's your parents. Maybe it's your partner, maybe it's your children, and you feel like if you were to add any stress into your life, that would somehow upset the balance in a way that would make things more or less unmanageable. It may also be that you're going through some other type of life transition. Maybe you're moving houses and you don't want to add to the disruption. It could be something else that is happening with your children. Maybe they are going through transitions themselves and you feel like the timing just isn't right. And so you want to stay put, even though you don't feel like where you are is a long-term solution for you. Finally, one of the reasons that keeps lawyers from transitioning, even though they don't feel like they're in the right place for them, is that they simply do not know what else it is that they want to do. Now, this can be and feel like a rather daunting challenge when you know that you're unhappy and yet you don't know what else you would do, whether it's in law, whether it's outside of law. And so rather than make a decision and run the risk of doing the wrong thing and not being able to backtrack, lawyers in that position will sometimes decide to stay where they are, even though they're not happy because they don't know what else they can do. And they're worried, they're scared that if they make a wrong move, that they'll somehow end up disappointed. So if you are in this situation, you may find that you resonate with any one of these reasons, maybe all 3 of them, and you may have your own reasons for staying where you are currently, even though you don't see it as being a long-term solution. And if that is something that you can relate to, then you may find that you fall into some of the sort of trappings, if I can describe it that way, of staying in a job that you aren't truly passionate about without a deliberate and intentional plan of how you want to approach it. So, for example, you might choose to stay where you are, even though you don't love it. And what you might decide, either consciously or unconsciously, is that your situation is hopeless, that you don't like the organization that you're in, and you give up trying to improve your situation. It's almost like you put your head in the sand and simply hope that things are going to get better. Now, it may also be that you're in the situation that you're in, you've decided not to do anything about it, and yet you find yourself getting increasingly resentful. You might feel resentful about the clients that you're working with, the clients that you're working with, your colleagues. You might find that the work is increasingly difficult for you to wrap your head around, perhaps substantively, perhaps because it simply doesn't align with your interests. And what you might find is that you are complaining to your partner, complaining to your friends, complaining to your mother, complaining to your colleagues even. And so that might be a habit or a trap that you find yourself falling into. Now, a third thing you may find yourself doing is fantasizing about leaving your job and going somewhere else and imagining how much better it would be. It may be, for example, that you're in private practice and your hours are really starting to wear on you. And so you look at a job in government, for example, and you imagine what it would be like and how much better it would be to have that particular job where you have hours that start at 9 and at 5 or whatever it is that you're imagining is going to be better about that particular job. It may be, for example, that you're in an organization, maybe you're in government or you're in-house, and you feel like your work is really being controlled by your boss or by the bureaucracy or whatever it is that applies in your particular situation. And so the fantasy is that you're going to break out and start a firm of your own, and that you're going to have the independence, you're going to have the control, you're going to have the autonomy. And that becomes the fantasy. And so instead of focusing on improving the situation that you currently find yourself in, you find yourself mentally somewhere else, fantasizing about a job that you don't have that you wish that you had had. Now, if you are in this position, what you might find is that your situation, instead of improving or even maintaining the status quo, becomes increasingly untenable. You've chosen to stay, you've made that decision, and yet you're neither here nor there. What you might find is that you're almost passively going through the motions, but you're spending your energy avoiding, complaining, and fantasizing, none of which serves to contribute to the improvement of your situation. Instead, what you might find is things only get worse. Now, this is not sustainable. What you might find is that over time, if you're not committed to proactively doing something within that organization, and I'll get to that in just a minute, that the system itself starts to break down. What you might find is that you become increasingly frustrated with your situation. You may find that you're increasingly lacking in making progress. And this may be driven in part by the organization that you're in, the system in which you're operating. And if you find that any of those other examples rings true for you, if you're kind of putting your head in the sand and not being particularly proactive in relation to the work that you're doing, if you find that you're complaining quite a bit about the work that you're doing or the people that you're working with, if you find that your energy is spent fantasizing about being somewhere else, then it makes sense that the energy that you otherwise would be spending toward advancing in your organization and making that progress simply isn't done. And so, yes, it makes sense that you might not be progressing at the rate that you wish that you were progressing at. Now, it may also be that you increasingly feel a lack of appreciation or recognition within your organization. And again, that may be tied to external factors. It may also be tied to factors that are in part motivated or resulting from your own disengagement in the workplace itself. You may find that you're increasingly frustrated with yourself because you know that you want to leave, and yet you're keeping yourself. It's almost like you're holding yourself hostage, waiting for things to get better. And as you continue to do that, it's almost like you have that internal battle where you're constantly weighing that decision back and forth, and that can be exhausting. And maybe there's a part of you that just wants you to make a decision once and for all so that you can be done with where you are and move on, regardless of what the consequences are going to be. It may be that you feel trapped because you've made this decision, you've committed, you've told yourself you're going to stay, and yet you're not happy. And so it continues to wear on you. You may fall into the trappings of self-sabotage. So these are these subtle things that you do that undermine your performance, that undermine your relationship. And it's almost like you don't even realize that you're doing these things, and yet you do them. And as a result, you sabotage your own success. And what can happen is that others start to notice that you're not seeming all that engaged, and then they may have something to say about it. And what can happen here in this type of situation is that you go from having control over the narrative to sometimes losing control over that narrative. And it's possible that you end up worse off in that situation than you would have been if you had taken the risk and made a transition out of where you are. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast episode, this is not an episode that is designed to persuade you or convince you that if you're unhappy where you are, that you ought to be making a move to something different. Not at all. The purpose of this particular episode is to own the decision, to realize that you have made a conscious decision to stay where you are. And the purpose of this episode is to offer you some strategies to make the best of that particular situation. I'm going to offer you 4 separate strategies. And as we go through these strategies, I would invite you to think about how these strategies could apply to you. If you don't see a direct link, then I'd invite you to think about how they could apply to you. What would need to change in order for this to be relevant for you in particular? Because ultimately, the time that you spend with me today is time that you're spending on yourself. It's troubleshooting your own particular situation and figuring out how you can make the absolute best of it. You've made that decision to stay, so let's figure out how to make it the best use of your time. So number 1 is we're going to be honest with yourself and the perceived fantasy and the practical reality. Now, what is it that I mean by that? I'm going to ask you to look at fantasy and reality from 2 different perspectives. Now, the first perspective is to identify the fantasy and bring as much of that fantasy into reality as is possible. So if you're in your current job, let's say you're working at a law firm and you're imagining that life is going to be much better if and when you go in-house, you might ask yourself what it is about an in-house position that resonates with you. Is it the idea that you would have a single client who you could focus on? Is it the idea that you would have more control over your schedule? Is it the idea that you would not need to have multiple clients that you're paying attention to? Think about what it is about the in-house experience that resonates with you, that comes to mind as being beneficial to you, and make a list of all of the things that you think that you would love about that fantasy role that you have in your mind's eye. Now, what I would then invite you to do is to figure out how you can identify what you already have in your current position that lines up with that fantasy. So if the fantasy is control over your schedule, I would invite you to think about where you do have control over your schedule, whether it's the opportunity to serve a client most effectively. I'd invite you to think about how it is that you, in your current position, are able to serve your client most effectively. So what you're doing here is trying to see where you already have in your current role things that you actually truly do appreciate about your role. Chances are, if you've made the decision that you don't want to be in your role, that you don't like it anymore, that it doesn't resonate, that what you're focusing on currently are the aspects of your job that you don't like, I'm asking you to shift the focus into the components of your job that you actually really do like, but maybe have lost sight of. Now, once you've gone through the exercise of identifying what it is in your current role that are aligned with that fantasy job that you wish that you had, I would invite you to then think about how you can go about creating more of that in your current role. So if you've identified certain qualities and you've identified some of that, how can you create more of that? How can you create more of an aligned and fruitful client experience? How can you create more control over your schedule? When you start asking yourself these types of questions, you'll start to see opportunities that you may not have seen before. Now, that is the first way of dealing with the fantasy and the reality, is to incorporate more of what you think you want into your current role, into your current reality. Now, the second aspect of this is to identify the reality of the fantasy. So again, if you have a fantasy in your mind's eye, there's something very safe about it. As long as it remains a fantasy, you'll never really see what the imperfections are that arise when that fantasy becomes a reality. So for example, if you were planning a trip, let's say you're planning a trip to Paris. and you're thinking about how amazing it's going to be. You're going to see the Eiffel Tower. You're going to buy fresh baguettes at the bakery. You're going to eat at the finest restaurants. You're going to see all the high-end fashion. I mean, you're really thinking about all the wonderful highlights that you're going to experience when you go on that trip to Paris. Now, what you're probably not thinking about when you're planning that trip is the flight over there. Maybe it's the lineups at the airport, or the fact that you're going to be sitting in this really tiny seat with your knees pressed up against the seat in front of you. Maybe there's somebody on your flight sitting next to you that, I don't know, speaks a lot, tries to keep you engaged in conversation when all you want to do is have a nap. You might land in Paris and find that your hotel is not what you expected. Maybe it's the middle of summer and it's much hotter than you had anticipated. And so there's going to be aspects of that trip, even the dream trip, the fantasy trip to Paris, that are going to force the starkness of reality onto you. And what I would invite you to consider is that even in the fantasy jobs that you're imagining in your mind's eye, the alternative to the work that you're doing today, there are going to be components of that are not aligned with what you love. So for example, you may find that you go in-house and yes, you love having the opportunity to serve a single client, but maybe you miss the variety that you have in your current practice. Maybe you miss the opportunity to work with different lawyers or different clients, or to have a different type of practice depending on what comes through the door. And so for every benefit that you'll receive by indulging or by moving into that fantasy job, there are going to be the trade-offs. And so what I'm inviting you to do here is to imagine what those realities are going to be. And by realities, I mean the ones that are going to be harder for you to manage for the purpose of leveling the playing field. It's one thing to look at your job and see how it is not what you think that you want. And when you compare that to a fantasy, and it's just a good part of the fantasy, you can see there's a large gap. It almost makes it more painful to be in your current position because the alternative seems so much better. And all I'm inviting you to do here is to acknowledge that even that fantasy role is going to have its challenges, and that helps to level the playing field so that you can better cope with the job you have currently. And if and when you ultimately do make a transition, you're making that transition with your eyes wide open. I'm not saying that you shouldn't make a transition. I'm not saying that the fantasy job doesn't exist or that it wouldn't be better, but I am encouraging you to look at it from that full perspective, appreciating that even within the fantasy, there are going to be elements of that other job that aren't going to align with you, that are going to be challenging. Now, that is the first strategy, is simply to be honest with yourself about, once again, bringing the fantasy into the reality and bringing the reality into the fantasy. The second strategy that I would invite you to consider is to do the hard work. Now, if you are in a job and you're finding it challenging and you don't think you want to be there, chances are there are a number of areas, a number of challenges or opportunities for you to grow, opportunities for you to learn about yourself and to do the hard work that is going to help you develop professionally and personally. Now, a way of figuring out what those challenges are is to look at that fantasy job once again, identify some of the attributes of that job that you would love to incorporate into your current role, and then you're going to have that voice inside your head that says, well, I'd love to do that, but, and there's going to be a problem. There's going to be a challenge. Chances are the obstacles are going to look something like this. They're going to involve difficult conversations with clients, with colleagues, maybe even with your family. It may involve actively soliciting the kind of work that you want, whether that's with internal clients or external clients. It may be actively soliciting mentors and others who will support you in the work that you do at your organization. It may also mean actively soliciting new clients. It may be setting up boundaries and saying no to opportunities, even opportunities that you otherwise would love to do because you're trying to redirect the nature of your work. It may be that you need to delegate more work to others. It may mean that you need to build a team that supports you and the work that you do. It may require that you be brutally honest with yourself, and it may require a heightened level of honesty with those with whom you work. It may also mean standing up for yourself and taking on a role of self-advocacy that you simply haven't taken on before. These are all some of the challenges and opportunities that you may have right where you are, where you can learn without having to go anywhere. These challenges and these obstacles become your learning ground. These may be the very skills that you need to develop to perhaps excel where you are and also set yourself up for success in your next role, whether it's at your current organization or somewhere else. Now, another thing I would encourage you to do here when it comes to doing the hard work is to take 100% responsibility for changing the reality of your practice. Now, in any relationship, whether it's a work relationship, whether it's a personal relationship, there's give and take. You are not entirely responsible for what it is that is going on in a relationship with another person, nor are you entirely responsible for what is happening in the workplace. But what I'm inviting you to do for the purposes of this exercise is to own 100% responsibility. That puts the power back into your hands so that you can make the positive changes that you wish to make. That means to seek out support if you need it, whether that's support within your organization, whether that's support outside of your organization. Maybe it's mentors, maybe it's working with a coach. It's whatever support you need to help you through this particular challenge or these particular challenges. I also invite you to take on these challenges one at a time. You can start with the toughest challenge and make that something that you look to overcome. That's going to give you the confidence that you need to take on the smaller challenges after that. Or you might start with the easiest challenge. Give yourself a relatively quick win and move on up from there. And finally, when it comes to taking 100% responsibility, I would encourage you as much as possible to step away from any role where you see yourself as a victim, somebody who is sort of at the mercy of what is going on around them, and instead move yourself into problem-solving mode. So that was suggestion number 2 out of 4. The first was, of course, to be honest with yourself about the fantasy and the reality. The second is to do the hard work. The next strategy that I'll offer to you is to look for the windows for changes. Now, whenever we're in a given situation, we tend to see it for how it is in the moment, and we base our projections of the future on what we see around us currently. So, what I would invite you to do is to start imagining the future and how it's possible that changes are going to happen that will open up opportunities that will align with you. Now, if you have children or if you spend any time with children, you will already naturally do this. We know when we have children that the child that we're going to be dealing with at 2 years old is going to have quite a different set of challenges and opportunities relative to a 10-year-old child. We know that the child is going to evolve, that their milestones are going to be different, that the situation that we're in for each of them will be different at each stage of time. And so let's apply that same thinking to your career and the job that you're in today. It's going to look different. The organization will look different 2 years from now relative to where it is today. People are going to come and go. Opportunities are going to come and go. The firm, the organization may have a new client. It may have a new mandate. Things can really shift for you. So what I'm inviting you to do for step 3 is to start looking, seeking out, proactively finding opportunities for change that you may not see if you're in that reactive mode. If you're in that head in the sand, I'm just here to bide my time until something better comes along or I feel like I'm ready to make a decision. Instead of taking that more passive approach, we're really going to take that proactive approach and seek out the opportunities. Now, if I offer a personal example, when I was practicing as a lawyer, around the time that I had my son, I was starting to crave moving from a position where I was doing litigation. So it was work that required me to be in court. The nature of the work was typically adversarial, and I wanted something different. And around that time, an opportunity came up in the firm that I was working at to take on a role that was more of a research lawyer role. And to me, that was ideal. It's not something that I could have predicted, But when that opportunity came up for me, it was a very wonderful fit for what I was looking for in terms of what I was interested in, and also what I found to be more compatible with shifts that were happening in my personal life. And I have seen this type of transition happen for a number of lawyers who, for whatever reason, have a shift in the focus for them. Sometimes it's moving from a commercial litigation practice into a knowledge management type of role, or maybe it's moving off a partnership-driven track into a counsel role. There are different ways of restructuring within an organization so that you get to do more of the work that you love in a fashion that aligns better with what you need out of your professional work. So those are some examples of how things might shift. The landscape might shift and opportunities will present that you simply didn't think were possible based on what things look like today. Now, the fourth strategy that I'm going to recommend is that you prepare yourself for transition. Now, even if your plan is to stay exactly where you are right now, I would invite you to prepare for transition, because what I have noticed is that inevitably, when you make a decision that something is no longer for you, the situation itself is not going to stay where it is and how it is indefinitely. There is going to be a shift at some point. The shift might take a number of different forms. A few examples of what it might look like is that you might change. You might change and learn to love the jobs that you're in. You might not see it at the moment, but it is possible. It may also be that the environment that you're in changes. Again, we spoke about people coming and going, practices adapting or changing. So you may be where you are currently and there's a shift, and all of a sudden you find that you're able to engage in work that you love. You're working with people that you really resonate with. And so that's a shift for you. Now, it may also be that there is a transition where you leave. You decide that the situation truly is no longer tenable, and so you transition to another role, another organization. Or it may be that you are in fact asked to leave by your current organization. So these are all possible scenarios where there is a transition. Not all of them involve you leaving the place where you are, but they all require some sort of a shift. And so what I would invite you to do is to prepare yourself. It's almost like you're training yourself to be the best possible version that you can be so that you're ready for that change, whatever that change happens to look like. Now, in order to do that, I would advise, number one, to do that hard work that we talked about under step number 2. It's to look at the growth opportunities and to throw yourself into those opportunities so that you can develop the skills, whether it's delegating, whether it's self-advocacy, whether it's setting boundaries, whether it's being more proactive about going after what it is that you want. These are all skills that will serve you regardless of whether you stay in your organization or take those skills with you somewhere else. I would highly encourage you to figure out what your strengths and values are. You may have naturally fallen into the position that you're in right now without having to do a conscious analysis of what it is you loved at one point about your job, what it was that drew you to the work in the first place. And so if you haven't done that conscious analysis, then what you may benefit from is to do an intentional exercise where you figure out what it is that you really value about your work, what it is that you are naturally good at. Because when you bring those to the surface, then you can find opportunities to bring those into your work at a greater level, whether it's in your current role or a new role that you choose for yourself. I would encourage you to do an audit of how you are spending your time, energy, and focus. So initially we were talking about different strategies that you might have if you simply default your way in your current role without proactively deciding how you're going to manage this time. So if you're in your role and you find that you're kind of avoiding doing anything out of the ordinary, you're sticking your head in the sand, you're just trying to get by day to day. If you are complaining about the work that you're doing, the people that you're working with, how unhappy you are, how stagnant it feels, if you're fantasizing, if you're spending your time and energy scrolling on LinkedIn and seeing what your classmates from law school are up to and imagining yourself in all these different roles without doing anything about it. Remember, this is a podcast episode about you deciding to stay where you are. So if you've decided to stay where you are, but you're out there looking at all these other opportunities, knowing that you're not actually going to take action on it, These are all ways in which you may be expending your energy without any fruit to bear at the end of it, at the end of kind of the hiding, at the end of complaining, at the end of scrolling and fantasizing. Is there anything that you have that is tangible to show for it? And my sense of it is that likely, unless you're taking concrete action based on those actions, then no, there's not really anything productive for you to yield from that expenditure of time, energy, and focus. Now, conversely, imagine that you are spending your time, energy, and focus on being proactive, on looking for those stretch opportunities, on challenging yourself to do the things that are hard for you. Imagine that instead of complaining, you are problem solving. You're figuring out how to make the situation better. And let's say instead of looking at how you could be so much happier in that other job over there somewhere else in that fantasy role, instead you're challenging yourself to make the best of the role that you are in. I promise you that if you are spending your time, energy, and focus on the second set of activities, that your experience of your work is going to materially change for the better. Another suggestion is to champion others. While you are in your organization, make the most of where you are and help other people to excel, to move up, whether these are individuals who are behind you in terms of seniority, or whether these are people who are ahead of you, who you really admire and who you want to see promoted within the organization. And then finally, I would invite you to build a team of support for yourself inside and outside of your organization. I invite you to look around and see who is in your immediate surrounding, who you think has a practice that you would want for yourself, and figure out how they think. Put yourself in situations where maybe you work with that person, where you have an opportunity to speak with that person. Maybe you can take them out for lunch or for coffee, simply drop by their office and have a conversation. Look at how they think about their work and some of the things that they do in order to excel in the organization. And I would invite you to start doing those things too. Now, even outside of your organization, again, I invite you to build up a strong network of mentors and colleagues, people who are of interest to you, whose practices are of interest to you. And I encourage you to develop those relationships because, again, the stronger your network is, the more you are going to learn and the better positioned you're going to be if and when you eventually do decide that what you would like to do is transition out of your current role and into a new one. Now, the last thing I'd like to cover. So I've offered 4 different ideas for how you can absolutely maximize being where you are when you're in a job that you don't think you want to be in, so you know you want to leave, and yet you choose to stay. And those 4 suggestions are: number 1, to be honest with yourself about the perceived fantasy and the practical reality. So we're going to look at the fantasy. We're going to see what it is that attracts our attention to that fantasy, what features of those jobs we like, and we're going to try to see where we already have them in your current role. And then we're going to see how we can bring more of those into your current role. Then we're going to look at the reality of the fantasy. So yes, the fantasy is wonderful. Just like that trip to Paris, when you're thinking about the sparkling lights and the Eiffel Tower at night. But when you're actually sitting on that plane and the person next to you won't stop telling you about their niece and nephew and maybe practicing their French on you, and all you want to do is go to sleep, that is what the fantasy actually looks like in reality. So can you bring that reality into the fantasy to level the playing field and put into perspective where you are currently? The second suggestion is to do the hard work, to look at where the challenges are, recognizing that the challenges that you have are unique to you, whether it's boundary setting, whether it's self-advocacy, or something else. These are challenges that when you overcome them are going to help you develop personally and professionally. The third suggestion is to look for windows of change. So as I mentioned earlier, your organization is not static. It is going to evolve and shift and change over time in ways that you simply cannot predict today. And so I invite you to have an open mind, to seek out those opportunities for change, and to then follow up on them. And then finally, prepare yourself for a transition, because a transition is going to happen, whether you adapt to your environment, whether your environment adapts to you, whether you choose to leave, or whether that choice is made for you. Chances are there is a transition in your future. And so let's get you ready to make that transition as seamlessly as possible and in a way that helps you develop professionally and personally. Now, with that being said, I would also invite you to think about whether or not you're in a situation where it's exceptional, where staying may not be the best decision for you. And there are a couple of situations where I could see that happening. Number one is if you're in an environment that you would describe as toxic, whether it's people that you're working with who maybe you find abusive to work with, or your volume of work is so great that you're barely able to keep up and it doesn't leave you any time to focus on anything other than work. And if that's something that resonates with you, I would invite you to seek out the support that you need. You may need the support of a lawyer, for example. You may need the support of a mental health professional. So you'll want to look into that and figure out whether or not you're in a working environment that is potentially harmful to you. Now, another exception that I would invite you to consider is if your mental health is suffering. So this may be tied up with the first exception that I mentioned a moment ago. It may also mean or be applicable if, for example, you're experiencing great deals of anxiety or depression or some other form of challenge to your mental health. And what you really need is a leave of absence, in which case, again, I invite you to seek out the professional help that you need, seek out the help of a counselor or somebody who can help you through that and help you navigate what decision would be best for you in that particular situation. Now, going back to the main theme of today's podcast episode, we're going back to the idea that you're in a job. It's not the job that you see yourself in your heart of hearts. You do not think it's for you. And yet you have decided to stay, whether it's for family reasons, whether it's financial reasons, whether it's because you just don't know where you want to go next. When you follow the suggestions that I've outlined in this podcast episode, it is going to help you. You may not be able to leave in the moment, but you'll no longer be drifting. Instead, what you'll be doing is you'll be setting yourself up with challenges and opportunities that will help you grow and increase your ability to thrive, whether you stay where you are or transition to someplace else. You'll need a few skills in order to do this. Number one is honesty, sometimes brutal honesty, honesty with yourself and possibly with others around you about what it is that you want. You will need to take responsibility. It may be tempting to fall into patterns where maybe you're complaining about your current situation or you're fantasizing about another situation and yet you're not taking active steps to change anything. And so what you'll need to do here is to take that responsibility and be proactive and go beyond wishing things were different and actually making things different for yourself. Finally, you're going to need to have a willingness to do hard things. The things that are hard for you are hard for a reason. It is because there is work to be done and it is not easy. It is not comfortable. And yet when you can bring yourself to take on those challenges, when you're willing to do those hard, difficult, and uncomfortable things, what you will find is that they lose their power over you. If you are terrified of standing up for yourself and you stand up for yourself, even in the smallest possible way, you'll start to build your confidence and that will become more natural for you. If setting boundaries is something that you really struggle with, when you start to set boundaries and you realize that it's okay that other people are going to manage, they may not love it, but they will figure it out, you will develop the confidence to set more boundaries. And as you do that, you'll be able to build a practice that aligns increasingly with what it is that you want, instead of building your practice based around not offending, not saying no to people, and trying to do and be everything for everyone. Now, the results that you will create is that you may stay where you are, but instead of doing it in a way that feels passive or where you're drifting or simply maintaining the status quo, instead you are staying with intentionality and purpose. Instead of feeling trapped where you are, you will learn to take charge of your career and create the portfolio of work and relationships that you want in your professional environment. eventually what you'll notice is that your situation will start to change. And when it does change, you'll be ready for it. Whether that turns out to be a promotion or similar where you are right now, or whether that means stepping into that next right role for you somewhere else. So, my dear friend, thank you so much for joining me here today. This is a topic, as I mentioned, it comes up frequently. And so if you find yourself in a position where you know or you strongly think that you want to leave and yet you've chosen to stay, these are suggestions that I think will help you to make the most of the situation that you are in and to ultimately thrive, whether you grow within your role currently or ultimately make a move somewhere else. And if you would like any support along the way, I would highly encourage you to reach out to me. I would love to support you. Thank you so much for listening. Again, if you like this podcast, if you would like to give it a rating and review, I would absolutely love that. It would mean so much to me and it will help other lawyers just like you find this podcast. So please go ahead and make a rating and review. I would love that. And for all of you, thank you again for tuning in. It has been a pleasure and I very much look forward to reconnecting with you again next week. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.